Since 2024, the Aligning Science Across Parkinson's Research Initiative has had grantees post preprints for 98% of the original research they eventually publish in a journal. Share 70 to 90% of the data sets, the analytic code, the experimental protocols, and the key lab materials that they generate in their research. And we've produced a database of over 10,000 entries outlining all the resources going into the research we fund and coming out of the research we fund. How did we get here? We have a robust open science policy. We monitor compliance with that policy, and we support grantees so that they can meet those policy requirements. In the next 9 minutes, I will fill in the blanks now, or fill in the gaps. Who are we? How did I come up with these numbers that I'm showing you? And through what mechanisms do we support grantees and monitor compliance? I'm here representing ASAP, or Aligning Science Across Parkinson's. We're a research initiative working to fill in the gaps in research on the development and progression of Parkinson's disease. Specifically, we create collaborative research communities and fund the development of research enabling resources, primarily in the basic research area and within the Parkinson's space. We run large-scale research programs, including the ASAP Collaborative Research Network, where we fund groups of academic researchers, which I will focus on today. We also have a genetics program called GP2, and a biomarkers program called PPMI. I'll now dive into our open science policy, which I have on the side of the screen there. If we take this presentation in the context of the funder-led initiative study presented in your abstract, this slide and the next ones will be the method section. So where do we start with this intervention? With a robust open science policy. We have 5 overarching requirements that are listed here. And in our detailed handbook, we divide these into 55 operationalized, actionable items. The overarching requirements are that they share all their data, their analytic code, their experimental protocols, and their key lab materials like cell lines, organisms, plasmids, and antibodies. The second point is that they identify all of the research inputs into their process. So same thing, if they have a data set that they reuse from another source, they have to unambiguously identify from where they got that data set. The third item to ensure immediate open access, which includes preprinting at the time of submission to a journal or earlier. Fourth one is to acknowledge their funder, and the fifth is to share the outputs within our collaborative research network. That's where we start. What does this look like in practice? We have what we call an open science compliance workflow, which I'll walk through now. The first part is we discover that our grantees produced a manuscript. Generally, we find this out when they send it to us because we ask them to. And this usually gets sent to us around the time of preprint deposition or before. If they don't send it to us, we find it because we scrape preprint servers and journals to see who has acknowledged funding from us. The second part is we run an automated process in partnership with the company DataSeer that scrapes a manuscript and outputs a list of data sets, code, software, protocols, and lab materials that are mentioned in the manuscript and whether those are identified unambiguously and deposited to a permanent location. We then manually curate that report to make sure that it's comprehensive and doesn't contain errors. We send that itemized report with some feedback to the authors, and then the authors revise their manuscript and send it back to us. We end up going through this cycle usually 2, sometimes 3 times, and eventually we mark the manuscript as compliant with our open science policy once they've addressed all the items that we've raised. One big improvement we had to this workflow that makes it flow much better is requiring key resources tables. So here I have a screenshot from a Cell Press article, which has been requiring these for, I think, since over 10 years now. And a key resources table just lists all the resources that go into and come out of your research. And so all the antibodies, cell lines, plasmids, data sets, software, etc., along with an identifier for those. We built on the infrastructure that CellPress, SciCrunch, and those others that have built up the key resource table work into our own ASAP formatted KRT, which is very similar, but just contains a little bit additional information. So we have the resource type protocols that we added. We have an additional column for new or reuse, so we know that whether the resource was newly generated within the research that we're funding and that is being reported, or whether it was pre-existing and they're using that. We also have an additional information column for any contextualization that needs to happen. Most of these KRTs get deposited to Zenodo, and then are accessible with the persistent identifier there. Okay, moving on to the results section. So this is the table presented in your abstract booklet, and I want to bring your attention to 3 parts of it. So we looked at 102 publications published from our grantees between beginning of 2024 and a few months ago. First row I'll bring your attention to here is data new. So this is newly generated data sets within the manuscript that we're looking at. The first number is 95. So 95 of the 102 publications had newly generated data. Second number here is 657. Within those 95 publications, there were 657 data sets. So we're not just matching one data set to one publication, but if you have microscopy data, neurophysiology data, animal behavior data, that's already 3 data sets. And then you probably have raw data for that, and you probably have some clean data for that. So that might be 6 data sets already. Then the final number highlighted there, 744, that's the number of data sets that we identified through the combination of the automated process and manual assessment that they could have shared. Second section I'll bring your attention to is the percent shared. So this is the 657 divided by the 774 from the row that's highlighted there. And we have sharing rates between about 70 to 90%, depending if you're talking about data, software, or lab materials or protocols. The last column I'll bring your attention to is the increase in sharing between the manuscript draft. So this is the first version that the grantees shared with us and the last version which was eventually published. So for sharing of new data, the initial version had 21% of the data set shared and it increased 67% all the way up to 88%. The second set of results I want to bring up here is what we call the ASAP collaborative key resources table. So those tables I showed you earlier, if we just take them and stack them one on top of each other, and in this case, we have 144 of them since we implemented this policy almost a year ago, we stack those on top of each other, and now we have a database of 10,000 resources that have gone into the research or come out of the research that we've funded. You can explore this data set. You can see whether these items are data sets versus code versus a lab material like an organism or an antibody. You can identify whether they're new or reused. You can do keyword searches to see which specific cell line identifiers are being used by multiple teams within our network. And the last result I want to bring your attention to is our success that we've had with preprints. So 98% uptake since 2024. These are getting published or getting posted as preprints 8 months before they're getting published. And they're also getting posted as preprints usually just before they're getting submitted to the journal in which they're eventually published. We have a bioRxiv channel, which is a collection of all the preprints on bioRxiv and medRxiv that our grantees have posted, which is where they post almost all of the preprints. And those have been viewed, the abstracts, almost 1 million times, and they've been cited over 1,200 times. Now, these are citations to the preprint DOI, not to the publication DOI. So by requiring preprints, by them posting it 8 months earlier on average, we're accelerating the sharing of this information, and it's already getting cited and integrated into the literature before it's ever published as an article in a journal. And this is all possible because the great work of bioRxiv and medRxiv making their platform easily navigable and useful. So why do we care about all this? Well, I would hope the research record looks something like this. Not just the top of the pyramid where you have a vetted claim, maybe the peer review, that should be open too. We're getting more preprints, that's great. But we have this whole stack of information, of knowledge, of effort, of scholarship that stands upon. And if we don't see the full image, then we can't verify whether the claims being made are accurate. By making this all available too, people can pull out parts of it for reuse. If there's clean data somebody wants to reuse, they can take that out. If there's an experimental protocol that they would like to reuse, and sometimes it's the same people reusing their own material 2 years later, and they have documented it nicely because they made it public. And so we would hope we have this thorough research record. If claims are verifiable and the resources are reusable, we hope this leads to more trustworthy science, more collaborative and more efficient research, and that eventually that would downstream lead to accelerated scientific discovery. To wrap it up, I presented our funder-led intervention alongside an in-house assessment of our success to date. what I took home from this work was that if we, as funders, as publishers, as institutions, act like we really care about open and rigorous science, I mean, put staff time towards it, put money towards it, put resources towards it, then the researchers that we support will engage like they also care about open, rigorous science. Thanks for being part of the conversation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Robert. Those are really impressive numbers. So congratulations. Do we have any questions? One at the back.
Hi, Lauren Cadwalder from PLOS. Thank you for sharing all that information. Great. I was wondering, in the compliance kind of checking, do you do any kind of quality control checking? You know, is the documentation shared with the code, for example? And if so, do you find that the outputs need kind of additional, like what percentage of outputs need like additional work to get them up to standard?
That's a great question. So in our policy, we write down exactly what we expect in terms of quality, but the thing is, everything that we require, we then have a mechanism to check for it. So the extent of our requirements are the extent that we have capacity to check. So we do, the numbers I show is it shared in line with our policy, which is there a persistent identifier associated with it? And there's some minor check for, is that data type shared? So if somebody says there's microscopy data and then they give you a link to Zenodo, if I open Zenodo, I don't find any microscopy data, then I will email them. However, it's not always easy to check if every single microscopy image. And so there's the existence of that type of data, which we check for. The comprehensiveness or completeness of it, we do very cursory checks for. And then there's the quality of it, which is very difficult to check without being an expert in that specific discipline. We do try to employ proxy requirements, like the requirement for a README file in any associated data or code deposit. And then also strongly recommending that they put data in a data type specific repository when one is available for genetics data or omics data, for example, because there will be a requirement for the associated metadata, and there will be some checking that platform can do for them. Thanks for the question.
Okay, let's move to the front here.
Yeah, Susan Glandiak, University of Louisville. Did you check how often the journal of the published article linked the DOI of the published article to that of the preprint?
How often is the published article linked to the preprint?
Yeah.
Short answer,
list
I've not checked this systematically. I would say not very often. This is one of the items. So in our policy, I said we have 55 items. They're either required, which means we check them. They're recommended, which means it's a little hard for us to check. And then there's what we call nice to have, which is we're not sure exactly the best way to implement this because there may be conflicting opinions. And so that's a nice to have one we have that says share your preprint DOI in your publication, but we don't want to put authors in the middle of a fight between a publisher who doesn't want the DOI in there and a funder who does. And so we have it in there as we ask them to. We give them a boilerplate statement that says the sentence with date, DOI, preprint repository, and some of the grantees do use this, but it's not systematic and comprehensive.
Okay, I think to the back.
Hi, Nick DeVito. I assume some of this is new for a lot of the researchers you work with, and as you try to get them to share protocols or share data or share code, what have you run into the most, I don't want to say resistance, but where have you had to handhold and help them, and kind of what's been the most difficult uptake amongst the people you work with? Practice to uptake, yeah.
Yeah. Code is one difficult area where it's a range of knowledge. Some of the teams we fund are very experienced in code sharing. There's no problems. Other people have never shared code before. And so there's definitely a learning curve to be had there. Also for data sharing, moving past just sharing the tabular data at the end of the process. So if there's actually microscopy images that you quantify, we don't just require the quantification. And so people just aren't used to sharing those images, so it doesn't occur to them. And then the quantified data often goes into point and click software that you don't need your data in a proper tidy format. And so then the data comes in a little funny format in an Excel sheet that's not so organized. So there's the process of learning how to share the tabular data in a nice tabular format that a software can read. And then for some teams more than other, getting code sharing. Those are the two that jump to mind immediately without looking into it systematically.
Yeah, thanks.
At the front?
Randy Ellis, Harvard Medical School. This is really incredible stuff. I think moving the locus of good practice enforcement from a journal that sees a study after it's completed to a funder that enables a study to happen from the beginning is absolutely phenomenal. And I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we get every other funder to do this? Because like, I'm thinking about the talk at the end of yesterday about the prestige economy for journals. But if we can remake the prestige economy for funders, that would be, that would just be awesome. I mean, every funder should do this.
Thank you for your kind words. I will admit we still have a long way to go. We've got data sharing, people are doing it to move towards computational reproducibility and that stuff. There's still a long way to go. Funders have a big influence at the beginning of the story. Publishers can have a big influence at the last stages of it. And I think it's not about who is the one person responsible, but how can we coordinate and work together to make sure that these things are shared. Thank you for the kind words.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, you just sort of related to that, representing the publishers myself. You know, how does this integrate? Because I think the solution is that both of us are working on this. Because absolutely the publishing comes so late in the day that suddenly asking authors to do a whole lot of things they didn't need to do and aren't really set up to do is difficult. But how did this integrate with so were you requiring all this before they even submitted, or was some of this iteration happening while they were also iterating with the journal?
Yeah, so the policy by word is by the time it's published in a journal,
Okay.
you must have everything deposited and shared. At the same time, in our policy, it says, by the time you preprint, you must send us your manuscript so that we can give you feedback.
Okay.
And so generally before the publication, when something gets sent to a journal, gets sent to us at the same time, we can have an influence on it. And usually by the time they're asked to send in their final version, they'll have everything lined up. Oftentimes shared already, but sometimes not shared yet, but just ready to click a button and say public once it gets published.
Interesting, because yeah, some journals are doing some of the same kind of checklists. So it would be really interesting if there could be some synchrony so that authors are not being asked to do almost the same thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then ideally, if they follow our policies, then most journal data sharing or code sharing, they would
absolutely,
covered.
they'd be covered. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Thank you. One more. Sorry, it's hard to see in these lights.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ann Bynum from Clarivate. What do you do if someone doesn't comply? Like, do you withhold their funding the next time, or is there any, way you can enforce this?
That's a great question. So at the moment, the initial round of funding that we gave out started in 2020, and grantees had the chance to renew their funding. And so before we made renewal decisions, every year we give them feedback on, here's how many manuscripts you sent to us, here's how many data sets, protocols, pieces of analytic code that you could have shared, and here's how many you have shared according to our statistics. And here's where here's the date you preprinted, and here's the date you published. And so we show this to them on an annual basis. So they know that we care about this, and they know that we're tracking these practices, and we make it clear to them that they're getting incorporated into renewal decisions. We have not had an instance so far where we say, you haven't complied with our practice, we are withholding funding.